Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce today Kayla Dang, who is assistant professor, a Renner professor of Islamic Studies at St. Louis University since 2022. She holds degrees from Notre Dame, University of Southern California, SOAS in London, and a PhD from Yale, defended in 2022, with a thesis on the Zoroastrian priesthood from the Sasanian to the early Islamic period. As it happens, you can find a snippet of her work in the Vienna-based journal Medieval Worlds, and today we get to hear a bit more. Kayla, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you for this invitation to give this talk, and thank you all for joining on a summer afternoon or morning, depending where in the world that you are. So I really appreciate you guys being here today. I'm going to share some slides as soon as I'm permitted to. And yep, okay, great. Let's get that going. There we go. Just let me know if you're seeing the correct screen view. Thumbs up. Okay. All right then. So I've titled this talk "The Unusual Travels of ʿAlī ibn Abī Ṭālib's Covenant with the Zoroastrians." And unusual may not be the right word, but travels, at least of this textual tradition, is what I hope the theme of this this group is about. So I'm excited to talk about this with you today. First of all, Zoroastrians, right? Not all of you may be familiar with who the Zoroastrians were, where, when, that sort of thing. So I'm just going to start with a little basic timeline of Zoroastrian history, if you will. Zoroastrianism, it's also called by its followers the Mazdayasnian or Mazda worshipping religion for the name of its god, Ahura Mazda. It's also called the Wahdain or the good religion by its followers. And it was once the religion of a succession of vast empires in Iran and its surrounding regions. And you can see there on the bottom the Achaemenids and the Arsacids or Parthians and the Sassanid dynasty, also the Sasanians. And the map shows the sort of height of the Sasanian Empire in the 7th century, just before the Arab Muslim conquest. So today, most of the Middle East is Muslim, and Iran's Zoroastrians are few. But a major turning point in the history, as you may know, is there for all the Middle East, really, was the Arab conquest of Iran, which really it didn't quite end in 651, but this is the sort of end date given to the Sasanian Empire. But it was really a decades-long endeavor that resulted in the collapse of many of the institutions that had relied upon the imperial patronage of the Sasanians, and whose imperial and local administration Zoroastrian priests had played a crucial role. And then the following centuries really saw the population's gradual conversion to Islam, as well as the migration of many Zoroastrians to India, perhaps starting as early as 800 CE. So there's a large group of Zoroastrians that live today, known as the Parsis. But a succession of Muslim caliphates and dynasties took over the former Sasanian and Zoroastrian lands. So you can see here in the green then to the right side of that. I'm just attempting to show a few of the ones that I might be talking about today. But my talk today really traces this tradition that intersects with various lines of transmission in this long and varied history among the Zoroastrians in Iran, as well as in India, and Muslims in both regions. And it's a tradition about an agreement or a covenant made by ʿAlī ibn Abī Ṭālib, who was the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, considered his rightful successor by Shi'i Muslims. And it's a covenant that was purportedly made in the early decades of the Arab conquest with the Zoroastrians of a particular family. And it's one that afforded them protection and privilege and even leadership over their community. This is simply one of many covenants purportedly made between the Prophet Muhammad or his early successors like Ali with non-Muslim peoples in the lands that they conquered. And the historicity of these covenants is debated, and I cannot really weigh in on that debate today, but instead I'll focus on the later travels or transmission of this Zoroastrian tradition of a covenant with ʿAlī ibn Abī Ṭālib. So let's see, there's memory of this covenant among the Zoroastrians of Iran in the 17th century, and there are also several 19th century reports by European travelers to Persia that mention this covenant among them. But the text of the covenant itself is transmitted by the Zoroastrians of India, or the Parsis, in a transmission that also dates back to around the 17th century. And as I'll describe later, says that it comes from the Arabic books of Muslims in Mughal India. So through my research, then I argue that this covenant is attested in a completely separate transmission that goes back to the late 10th century, one kept in the records of a secretary of the Muslim Buyid administration. And I'll get into the details of the memory and transmission of this manuscript later, and I'll situate the traditions of this covenant alongside or in comparison to similar covenants made by Muhammad or Ali and other early Muslims with Christians, Jews, and others. But first, I'm going to sort of zoom out and give some context about why I'm talking about the covenant of Āḷī with the Zoroastrians. It's part of a larger book project that I'm currently revising on the Zoroastrian priesthood in Islamic society. And in this book, I use Arabic sources alongside Zoroastrian ones to situate the Zoroastrian priestly authors of the extant Zoroastrian Middle Persian works, or also called the Pahlavi books, and I situate them in their Islamic context. So the Arabic sources then illustrate a range of attitudes towards Zoroastrians and their religion. Again, this is just summary of some of the main points of my research. So despite being a dualistic religion and without a shared scriptural tradition with Muslims, Zoroastrianism was nevertheless accepted by Muslims and their developing Islamic legal tradition under the protection or dhimma of God and his messenger Muhammad. And these Arabic sources are also roughly contemporary to the period of Zoroastrian Middle Persian writing in the 9th and 10th century, or else they narrate events from that time, or otherwise mention various Zoroastrian priests in the court of Muslim caliphs participating in interreligious disputation, while some Arabic authors cite Zoroastrian priests as the authors of books and others quote them personally. So they provide evidence of Zoroastrian priests as part of Islamic society and its intellectual traditions. At the same time that the extant Zoroastrian written works were written and redacted. Furthermore, particularly in this covenant tradition that I'll discuss today, it's in Arabic sources that we see a demonstration of the authority of a particular family of priests as legitimized by Muslim rulers. And this is a part of Zoroastrian history that's missing from standard narratives, and it's a view that would be lost without Arabic sources like the one I'm going to talk about today. So with that background in mind, I'll just limit myself to discussing this covenant tradition, again, made by Ali ibn Abī Ṭālib with the Zoroastrians of a particular family. So I'll get into the content of it, I'll compare it a bit with other covenants, and then I'll examine its transmission and its relationship to this edict from the 10th century that I mentioned. So in 1851, the Parsi scholar, philanthropist, businessman, Sir Jamsetji Jijiboy, he's an interesting figure, should look up sometime, but I won't get into that now, but he published an edition and a Gujarati translation of a few covenants. The first one is one made by Muhammad, the prophet, with the descendants of Salman al-Farsi, who is the first Persian convert to Islam, so very famous within both the Muslim traditions and Zoroastrian ones in a way. So, but the second covenant that he publishes here, that I've underlined, is a covenant given by Hazrat Ali, and it's addressed to Bahram Shah ibn Hiradrus. The second part of the name is a little garbled, and it's not quite clear what it is. But he's al-Majusi, Magian, or Zoroastrian. And furthermore, in the text of this covenant, it says that he's the one in charge of their religious affairs. So it's addressed to him and to his family, who trace their lineage to someone named Āḍurbāḍ ibn Mārsfand, the Persian, who is a figure from the Sasanian period, so hundreds of years before Ali, before the Arab conquest. This is a figure who lives in the Zoroastrian tradition, is purportedly a high priest of the Sasanian king Šāpūr II. So these are supposed to be his descendants, and it includes them under the covenant of God and his protection, the ʿahd Allah wa-l-dhimma. And it's dated in the document to 39 Hijri, or 659 CE, and it says that it was dictated by Ali to his son al-Hussein. And it further stipulates certain privileges for the family of Āḍurbāḍ ibn Mārsfand, including leadership over their community, exemption from payment of the jizya, the poll tax. And here also it says exemption from the sadaqat, which probably means something like land tax here, not the alms tax that it would come to mean later in the tradition, later in like the Islamic legal tradition. It also gives this particular family the right to levy the jizya from other members of their community, and it states their authority in legal matters in their community, including with regards to inheritances. So as I mentioned, there are many other covenant traditions made between Muhammad or Ali with Christians, Jews, Samaritans, and other groups. And there are many textual parallels suggesting some kind of common tradition or source. And I won't go into all of these parallels today, but I sort of list a few examples here, and I'll provide bibliography in a second as well. And just to sort of summarize some of the common features that they share. Now, there are many actual textual parallels, but some of the common features, just in summary, that they're addressed to a specific family or religious group of a particular geographic region. For example, that, you know, the Christians of Najran, or the Christians of Armenia, or the Christians of Persia, and so on. They invoke the covenant protection, again, the ʿahd wa-l-dhimma of God and his messenger. They state various protections, and the language here, there are many parallels as well. Something like for persons, property, wealth. Also, they might mention houses of worship, endowments and inheritances, and so forth. And some of these covenants even exempt certain persons, as in the covenant I just showed you, exempt certain persons like religious leaders or even monks from payment of the jizya, poll tax. And furthermore, these covenants are addressed to all Muslims, again, formulaic language, and they usually provide a reason for the covenant in return for services rendered, arms that these peoples have provided to the Muslims, or otherwise military assistance, and or this phrase about they've given good counsel or something like that. And they end with the name of the author or the scribe, the date, and a list of witnesses. Now, the one I mentioned for the Persians does not have a list of witnesses, and the reason given for the covenant is slightly different than most of the others. There's no mention of military aid or anything of that nature. It's just in recognition for the good leadership of the community that this individual has. So I get into more of this in the book project I'm working on, and probably also a forthcoming article. So I'll just leave it at there for now. But I just wanted to share, let's see. Well, that many of these features that I just mentioned, they're also common in pre-Islamic treaties, pacts, surrender agreements used by the Byzantines, the Sasanian Persians, and other scholars have noted this, right? But they show some continuity with pre-existing practices. But it's also equally true that the Islamic tradition of such agreements and covenants, really, it took decades or even centuries to develop into something that was standardized and formulaic. So I can't speak to the authenticity of these covenants for the 7th century when they're supposed to have been written, but I note that many of them were also brought forth again in the 10th century or later periods, in periods of particular instability in the Abbasid Caliphate, for instance, or in like later regime changes. And some of these agreements were contested by their contemporaries, like the treaty with Salman al-Farsi and the privileges granted to his descendants. They were contested, some were dismissed, like this covenant with the Jews of Khaybar and Mukna. People thought it was fraudulent, you know, in the 10th and 11th century. While other communities were granted similar edicts of protection to the one I'm going to talk about in a moment, like the Sabians of Haran, Raqqa, and Dia Modar. In any case, it seems to be another feature of all these agreements that they would be brought forth and re-authenticated or not when new Muslim rulers came to power. So this is a copy of a covenant, the Covenant of the Monks of Mount Sinai, made in 1638. It's supposed to be the hand or the seal of Muhammad there on the bottom. And then here is a later 19th century copy of it made in 1858. And in both instances, I believe they're copied for or authenticated by the Ottomans. So just this is a theme of them that they're brought up back again and again. And just to quickly note that here's lots of other people have written about these and in very interesting and nuanced ways. So I just put a few things up there. But if you recall, I said that the edict, or the covenant for the Zoroastrians that I just showed, it was published by Sir Gigi Boy, along with that better known covenant of Salman al-Farsi. And that tradition has been written about a great deal more than the one that I'm talking about today. It was mostly dismissed as a modern forgery because we had no previous literary textual parallels as we do with the Šamṣām Treaty, which there are 10th and 11th century authors that give the same text of it, right? But this one for the Zoroastrians of the family of Āḍurbāḍ, there seemed to be no earlier example of it in the literary tradition in Arabic or even among the Zoroastrians. And none of the works that transmit that Šamṣām Treaty also transmit the Āḍurbāḍ one, with a few exceptions that I'll talk about in a second. And even though early Arabic conquest narratives, geographies, legal literature, they record surrender treaties and pacts between the conquering Muslims and various cities of Iran. And some of those are even represented by Zoroastrian priests. This specific covenant of ʿAlī with the Zoroastrians of Āḍurbāḍ's family is, as far as I can tell, we can't point to any specific mention of it in those early Arabic accounts, right? So how does it end up in India in the 19th century in that edition that I mentioned? So now I'm going to talk more about the transmission of this text. Sorry if you can't see the top of my slideshow there, but so as I said, Jamsetji Jijiboy published this in 1851, and he says that he got these covenants from a manuscript in his father's collection, who got the text from a prominent family of Surat in India. And then Jijiboy mentions a few other Arabic and New Persian works, but they by name, but these are mostly to provide the context of these covenants and sort of provide arguments for their authenticity. And it's not clear which text he actually got it from. But as other scholars have noted, there is another manuscript that's now in the British Library. It's originally from the India office that contains these covenants, the Šamṣām treaty or pact, as well as the one with the Zoroastrians of Āḍurbāḍ's family, and another Šamṣām document. And it's an Arabic, it has the Arabic text with line by line Persian paraphrase. So I just put the beginning of the covenant with the Zoroastrians here on the slide. So you can see where it switches a slightly different script from Arabic to then the Persian. And it's the Arabic of that matches almost exactly with what Jijiboy published, although the Persian translation that he provides is not that similar to this Persian translation here. This is mostly like a paraphrase. But in any case, in the middle of these texts, the Šamṣām text and this covenant with the Zoroastrians, there is a colophon. So even though this manuscript that I'm talking about here is from 1802, the colophon says that in 1654, someone named Nanabai Punja, he discovered these texts in Surat. Again, notice that's where Jijiboy said his father got them from. In the library, though, of someone named Syed Musa. And it turns out someone's noted that this is a relative of Shah Jahan, the ruler of the Mughal Empire. So in other words, this is not a covenant tradition passed among the Zoroastrians, but it's supposedly gotten from Muslims, from their Arabic books, which is supposed to, again, make it more authentic sounding, and perhaps why then people dismissed it as a forgery. Like that's, that's too good to be true kind of thing. Right. However, in an article that you mentioned that I published in 2022, I note the existence of this Buyid era edict dated to 986 CE. So I'm going to explain what the relationship is of that covenant tradition that I just mentioned, is that has seemed kind of suspicious or dubious or modern forgery perhaps with this text. So the secretary, Abū Isḥāq Ibrāhīm al-Ṣābiʻī, he records in his diwan or collection of letters an edict of the Buyid amir, Ṣamṣām ad-Dawla, and is dated to 986 CE, and it's addressed to the community of the Magians, the Zoroastrians, from the descendants of Āḍurbāḍ ibn Mārsfand, that same Zoroastrian priest that appears in the other covenant, right? And this Buyid edict confirms certain rights for these particular Zoroastrians under the covenant protection of God and his messenger. It states that the edict is actually a response to a petition made by these Zoroastrians and is therefore reaffirming rights that had previously been stipulated for them in a document in their possession. So I'm underlining here a few of those phrases that I just mentioned, sort of in the middle of the page. This, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's the kitaban that's in their hands from ʿAlī himself. So it makes reference to an original covenant. And furthermore, and this should be, well, let me just say a moment about this manuscript here. This is one of the few manuscripts that actually contains this edict. It's only in certain collections of this Secretary al-Ṣābiʻ's works. So this is maybe perhaps why it was sort of overlooked. But now it has been published in an edition, and then I offered a preliminary translation of it in this article from 2022. And at the time, I dismissed this agreement as spurious, obviously, right? The Zoroastrians playing up this original covenant with Ali. It's an obvious ploy to these Shi'i Muslim rulers. And it very well may be, but when I wrote the article, when I dismissed this tradition, I was completely unaware of that Parsi covenant tradition that I just spent, a few minutes talking about. And probably because that had also been dismissed by many scholars outside of the Parsi community. And it wasn't until an advisor and colleague of mine who works on the Parsis in early modern India who told me about this source, like, this sounds pretty similar to what you've been working on. But as I mentioned, it had been all but overlooked in preference to that other Salman treaty, which had Arabic literary sources that could back it up from a much earlier time. And yet, the closer you look at this edict, it also enumerates these protections for this particular family, the special privileges that should be familiar to you from the covenant slides I showed earlier. It gives this family the exclusive leadership over their community, exemption from paying the poll tax, the right to levy that tax from other members of the community, and their authority in legal matters, including with regards to inheritances. In fact, as I demonstrate in this book that I'm working on, and perhaps also a separate article, each section of the Buyid edict corresponds exactly with a section of the covenant for Bahram Shah and the family of Āḍurbāḍ ibn Mārsfand. It affirms the covenant point by point, which suggests that the document itself, or one like it, was available to Zoroastrians and Muslims in the 10th century. And again, I cannot speak to its historicity or authenticity for a period before that, but its existence in the 10th century seems certain. And in the 10th century, this claim was verified by Muslims and evidently continued to be transmitted in a now lost or obscure Arabic and/or New Persian manuscript tradition into the 17th century, when it was then brought to India and copied by our friend Nanabai Punja. So I started looking for this references elsewhere in the Zoroastrian tradition. And initially I could hardly find any references to it, but I was helped out by some of the scholarship that I put on the slides before, particularly the work of John Andrew Morrow, who collected a lot of these references. But I'll just note, well, okay. First, I'll give this example here. There's this 17th century verse that it's a versified New Persian text, but versified from a text that's known in Middle Persian called the Spirit of Wisdom, or the Menoi Khrad. And in this 17th century version, I think it's 17th century, it's also a little bit confusing about who this Marzban Rostam Rawari was and when he lived. But in any case, if we can date this to the 17th century, he refers to a covenant made by Ali several times in this poem. And he otherwise promotes Ali as a protector and defender of the Zoroastrian religion. And in the context now of Safavid Iran, right, when they were facing persecution of a different kind. So it makes sense here. And I just want to note that this is not long before Nanabai Punja is said to have found a covenant tradition in Surat in India, right? So back to this idea of the intersections of a tradition, it's clear to me that the basis of the Parsi transmission of this tradition is at least based on the same text, or maybe the same pre-existing document that's behind the Buyid edict of the 10th century. But what is the basis of the Iranian tradition about this covenant with Ali? Is it also based on this same document held within the Zoroastrian community for centuries? There's kind of a gap here of evidence. Or does it come from the Parsis themselves, who have at this point entered into a long history of correspondence with their Iranian co-religionists, exchanging manuscripts and things like that? Or does it come if the 17th century allusion is maybe to the Charter of Salman, it's kind of ambiguous. Like which pact is he talking about? Is it this one or a different one? Or do we even know the date of that 17th century poem, supposedly? Or maybe the Parsis are sharing this with their Iranian friends in the 19th century even. So, and I would point to, at least this is some of the suspicion about it, right? That in the 19th century, the Parsi Zoroastrians started this Society for the Amelioration of the Conditions of the Zoroastrians of Persia. And among their aims is the remission and abolition of the jizya, which they eventually accomplished. But they use this tradition of a covenant, the edition of Gigi Boy that I mentioned. They use this tradition as a basis, again, for the remission of the jizya and things like that. So it's unclear to me exactly how this tradition is preserved, but in any case, it seems fairly common among both the Zoroastrians in Iran and in India by the 19th century when that edition was published. And here are a few of these traveler reports from the 19th century that mention that the Zoroastrians in Iran have this covenant, or I think, yeah, the Jacob Edward Pollock calls it a Fry brief. And he even says that he refers to it as an actual physical document and that it's in Yazd, which is a city where many Zoroastrians live at this time. So I'll zoom back out at this point and sort of wrap up the talk by saying, and thinking about this in the bigger picture of the medieval Middle East or the global Middle Ages, or however you want to term it, the travels or transmission of this covenant tradition, they offer a great deal to this conversation. But first, as I mentioned, they demonstrate the authority of this particular family of priests, and they add this element that it was legitimized by Muslim rulers. And it might further add this element that this is a tradition that's actually passed among Muslims and in place of maybe the Zoroastrians. It seems like these are the manuscripts that they got it from. But at the most basic level, it also, discussion of this covenant includes Zoroastrians in conversations about relations between Muslims and non-Muslim others. And there are many studies about the relationship between Muslims and Christians and Jews and so on. And usually Zoroastrians just have a passing mention here, right? So part of my aim is to include them more fully, particularly when they were the religion of an empire. And there were many Zoroastrians within Iran, even for centuries after the Arab and Muslim conquest. This covenant also provides another example of the renewal recertification process of such covenant agreements, which by some argument might prove their authenticity rather than their fraudulence. But and then, even more broadly, I want to think about this tradition as a way to highlight the divisions between our academic disciplines and encourage collaboration between them. So scholars working in New Persian and scholars working in Arabic, scholars working on Zoroastrian studies, Iranian studies, and scholars working in Islamic studies. We don't often talk to each other, and we should. This is the only way that I was able to find out the connections between these things. It's only due to the colleagues who pointed me there and who helped me with translations too in certain cases. So that's why I really enjoyed and appreciate the opportunity to talk to this group here and to share some of this work with you, because I know you're all working on very different and interesting things. And yeah, I'll end there for today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Kayla, for a wonderful talk. It's intriguing material. We have time for some questions. So I would suggest if you have a question, you can raise your digital hand. You can also, if you're unable to speak, you can just write a question in the chat and we'll read it and we'll talk about it that way. Maybe I can start us off with a question about sort of the issue of geography, which is this person, what was it, Āḍurbāḍ ibn Mārsfand. Do we know anything about where he was located? Because I seem to remember sort of it's similar in terms of, I remember from other contexts where you have these covenants, or at least discussions of sort of, what's the word, when the sort of a city is handed over, where there are examples where the Muslims have discussions with negotiations with bishops. So that happens. Yes. So are they representing initially sort of one location, and is it Ctesiphon or another important city? Do we know any of that, or are they speaking for an entire region at the same time?
Right. So the covenant tradition, the text of that tradition is just addressed to an individual named Bahram Shah ibn something or other, and he's from this family of Āḍurbāḍ ibn Mārsfand. So Āḍurbāḍ himself was from the 4th century. This covenant is supposed to be from the 7th century, and we don't know anything about this Bahram Shah. I've not been able to identify him with any specific person in any specific place. And this covenant tradition is then slightly different from many of the others, which do specify, like you said, either a city or a region, like I mentioned, the Christians of Armenia or the Christians of Persia, the Jews of Khaybar and Makna, right? There's no geographic region that's specified. So then later Zoroastrians, and the Parsis in particular, especially in their later understanding of who this Āḍurbāḍ person was from the distant past, they generalized it to this means all Zoroastrians, all Parsis, I think is the whole Parsi nation, I think is how Gigi Boy translated it in his title page. So we don't know, and I would love to know. And you're right, there are also Arabic accounts of surrender agreements with specific cities in Iran, and some of them even with Zoroastrian priests. Because again, this text doesn't actually call them priests, but the traditions about Āḍurbāḍ make it clear that this is a priestly family, and the way that the authority in their community is talked about even within the covenant. He's in charge of religious affairs and things like that. So we don't know who or where, and I would love to know those things.
Yeah, because it reminds me of a case. Well, you mentioned the Christians of Armenia, where you have the case, for example, the early 8th century, where the Catholic cause is the representative, and he has the agreement with the Muslims. But I don't know, in this case, if that would suggest that it is with some kind of later idea rather than something much earlier. But
well, the edict version of the covenant, if we could call it that, does not name a specific individual. It just says it's addressed to the family of this Āḍurbāḍ. So at that point, as I try and argue in the book, this comes to present this particular priestly family and their authority within the Zoroastrian community. And we might have an idea of who the representative might be at that time in 986 CE, but we don't know who the original person of the agreement is if we can never find that out.
Frustrating, but yeah, very, very challenging, very interesting. Okay, Dan has a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I found fascinating, especially the mess that you have in your hands, trying to establish at what level between the 10th and 19th century these traditions appear, and all the connections that you have to, of course, fully spell out and follow every trail. That's a very interesting situation to have to deal with. And but I'm curious about the initial document and the charge of forgery. We do get that every now and again. I mean, often in every field, the word is the same, forgery, but the charge is developed in different ways, like the type of argument. How did they, the scholars who argue for that is a forgery, how do they go about claiming that? I'm very curious.
So, and I can point you to some other scholars who discuss this more in detail, but basically, even the scholars in the 10th century who are looking at these covenants are finding issues with the date that's in the document. Oh, well, they weren't using the Hijri date at that point yet, so therefore it must be a forgery. Or look at the witnesses that have signed. There's maybe something in, like maybe they didn't all actually live at the same time, or some of these have like 40 people listed on them who were all companions of the Prophet Muhammad, but there might be some issues with who is named among those signatories. Again, the covenant version for the Zoroastrians doesn't have any signatories, so we don't have that issue. Or Muhammad supposedly couldn't read or write, right? So he has to dictate it to someone, and so there's a scribe, and there might be an issue with that or something too. Even Ali supposedly dictated this one for the Zoroastrians. So there's issues like that are pointed out, other language and terms that are used in the covenants. Oh, well, that didn't develop in Islamic law until later, its use in that particular way or something like that. So I would point to Levi Rubin's work on the Pact of Umar, right, the Shurut Umar, and all of the development of this tradition. So it does develop, and but there still could be an argument for that, you know, even though some of those texts that share traditions like that, or maybe from the 8th century or later, there was still a sort of shared formulaic way of forming these agreements. I mean, even the early conquest accounts are fairly formulaic. Like if you look at Baladhuri and the way that he talks about the conquest of different regions and cities and the terms that he uses and the surrender agreements that are rendered. Yeah, and especially because a lot of these are pre-existing, as I mentioned, within the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. So yeah, that answers that question.
It does. But yeah, I mean, for a document, we can still have an historical document, not a modern forgery that has formulaic, like I said, things in there and anachronistic data and wrong data.
Right, things like that could be added later once the Hijri date was in use, especially because we know that these were copied and re-authenticated and so on. So but yeah, I'll remain agnostic about their authenticity, but what I find interesting then is that, at least for the case of the Zoroastrians, we have this edict, again, in a completely separate tradition that authenticates it, at least for a time, right? That it was deemed authentic by Muslim rulers. So
yeah, I find it very interesting that you found a different context and external type of evidence for it, even if it's a tradition about it, not the exact text. Well, it doesn't, yeah, it's still very, very interesting.
And it is very close. There are many textual parallels. And I will, again, I'll say here, I didn't have time to talk to mention this, that the only reason I found a Buyid edict is from a footnote in earlier scholarship on the Buyids. And then I followed it down. At that time, the text hadn't been edited yet, you know, this scholar from the 1970s. And then I found another reference to another manuscript that might have had this. So it might even show that it was re-authenticated at different times in the Buyid era as well. But I wouldn't have, found this document without reading closely in the footnotes. Always read closely in the footnotes.
Oh, right? Yeah. We derive our scholarship from lost footnotes in past scholarship. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, Georgia?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. It was really fascinating and I learned a great deal. I have just a curiosity. If I got you correctly, you said that text printed by Gigi Boy, this the text that was edited, but that there's also a British library manuscript. And the Arabic is the same, but there are some differences in the translation. Can you tell us more as to what you think happened there? What's the relationship between the two?
So I'll admit that my new Persian is quite rusty. So I had the help of some colleagues on this. I did work through the Persian, I'll call it a paraphrase in the British Library manuscript. And at least it doesn't match exactly what Gigi Boy's Persian translation is. So I'm not sure if, so Gigi Boy printed the Arabic text. He also has a Persian translation and a Gujarati translation. And I'm not sure where the Persian comes from. I don't recall what he says about it. But it does not seem to match the Persian paraphrase that's in this British Library manuscript. And even I was talking with a colleague about this who, again, works more with the Parsis, or works on the Parsis, that it doesn't seem like a Parsi translation, if you will. Like the terms that it's explaining in this British Library manuscript, the terms that it uses and that it explains does not make one think that it was produced by Persian-speaking Parsis. So she's like, oh, maybe this was, you know, the Mughal court translation or something like that. But I'm not sure about it. It just doesn't, it's different and it doesn't seem to be produced in the same context. That's all I can say at this point.
Do you think did you did the translation himself or got it from?
I don't know. I'm sure he that he says, but I don't recall.
Okay. No,
and I haven't looked at that closely at the Persian, so I'll admit. Yeah.
No, of course. Yeah. Thank you.
And I don't do Gujarati at all, so I can't be much help there. But he did the Gujarati for sure.
It was just a curiosity, but that's perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. Yasmin Amin.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating. I am from a completely different discipline. I work on gender and Islamic studies. And I came to the Zoroastrians because of child marriage. I don't know if you know the famous hadith about Aisha. And then I discovered that there are so many different forms of Zoroastrian marriages, child marriage being amongst them. And during my research, I found out that the Abbasids, when they were overthrowing the Umayyads, they were actually agitating against the Umayyads, that they were so lenient with the Zoroastrians and they didn't force convert them. So to have this edict is absolutely fascinating for me. Thank you so much for shedding light on that. It's very useful.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, something I try and show in my book project too is just that there's a whole, like I said, range of Muslim attitudes towards Zoroastrians at different times and different places. But they also show that Zoroastrians were a part of this Islamic society, both for the Umayyads in a way and the Abbasids. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you very, very much indeed.
You're welcome.
I was also just curious, why this, you mentioned it a little bit, so why in this 17th century versified poem, the covenant comes up, and this might be an issue with polemics with the Safavid versions. Can you say a bit more about that? What's the context there?
Well, at least that's how, so I came across it again through scholarship of others that, and the translation that I provided by Khan Baghi, he suggests that this is I don't know if he fully suggests that it's contrived, but he does place it in the context of the Safavid Iran in the Shi'i Muslim state there. And this is a way for the Zoroastrians to sort of retroactively imagine Ali as a patron and defender of the Zoroastrian religion, right? So that's how at least that scholar presents it. And because it's part of a longer narrative in which Ali visits the tomb of Khusro Anushirwan, the great Sasanian king. He visits, well, not only that. Okay, so so Ali supposedly meets a Mobed, a Zoroastrian priest, who recites for him some of the maybe the Avesta, something that Zarathustra himself has written that predicted the coming of Muhammad. Okay, and so Ali is impressed by that. And then after talking with this Mobed, he goes to visit the tomb of this great Sasanian king, which is outside Baghdad. Well, Baghdad doesn't exist yet, but outside of Ctesiphon. And he visits the tomb of the king. He is awed by it, and there's tablets there, an inscription there that foretells the coming of Ali to the tomb. So he's impressed by that. And so he leaves the tomb and he is just praising the Zoroastrians, and on his way to Mecca for the Hajj, I guess, or just returning to Mecca, that is where he writes this covenant for the Zoroastrians, supposedly in this account. Now there are other versions of this story of Ali visiting the tomb of this king. There are other versions of this story where it's Ma'mun who visits the tomb and is awed by it. There's other versions where it's Harun al-Rashid. So it's a very teasing out all the different versions of this tradition and just show that it was continually readapted for different contexts. And yet it still mentions this covenant tradition, which I hadn't known about and has, again, largely gone unnoticed or been dismissed, and there might be a basis for it.
So am I getting this right then, that these sort of polemical things that are happening in the background, it's all about the religion itself? It has nothing to do with sort of exemption of taxes, all of these other things that pop up in the covenant?
No, that's always an issue as well. But, persecution of the non-Muslim groups took a variety of forms, right? But at least in the Safavid period, the Zoroastrians are supposed to have been very, well, it's hard to say. The accounts of them say that they're kind of poor and really diminished and marginalized, but we also know that they were in control of some trade networks. So there is a financial element to it as well. And I'll also note that in the covenant tradition and in the edict, it stipulates that the jizya that the Zoroastrians are to pay, because there are still Zoroastrians paying the jizya, that's clear. It's just that the leaders of their group are exempt. But the jizya that they're to pay is listed as a single dirham, which is very low and much lower than any of the other covenant agreements. I mean, it's like nominal, you know. And we know for a fact that in later historical periods, they were the Zoroastrians were supposed to pay much higher rates of this poll tax. So that might be part of the element of this as well, you know, reducing it. Look, here's a document showing, you know. But yeah, even in the Buyid period in the 10th century, I believe, I'll double check, it also listed as a single dirham, which is again very low. Yeah.
That would be great to have those kind of level of taxes.
Yeah.
Okay. Does anyone have any other questions? Dan has another one.
Yeah. I'm still interested in the document with the forgery charge. I'm curious. So, is this one manuscript? Does it have any other reception, or it's only the modern scholarly reception? You know, I'm trying to see what happens with the document, irrespective of where it starts from.
Okay. Do you mean the one for the Zoroastrians, or?
Yep.
So I mentioned, so Gigi Boy published this in 1851, and then there's another edition and translation in, again, all by Parsi scholars, in 1925 by someone named Nariman, and then in the 1990s, another Parsi named Mithu Korlawala publishes it, again, in English translation. And each of them is fairly consistent in saying, like, look, this is real, this is authentic, and we need to use this furthermore to better our relations with Muslims in India and in Iran, you know. And because also, like, the history of the Orientalist scholarship and the place of Parsi scholars within Zoroastrian studies has at times, let's just say that a lot of those arguments are dismissed by other Western or Orientalist scholars, right? So that's why I don't work on the early modern or Parsi period, Parsi Zoroastrian tradition so much. So I had never even heard of this. Like, it's not something that's brought out in other scholarship, really. Now, again, most of the argument that I could see is just that it looks suspicious, right? It comes at a time when they're actively petitioning for the reducement or removal of the jizya on their co-religionists in Iran. So how convenient, right? And even some of the scholarship that I cited in this talk, who they mentioned Maro, but also Zayn and al-Wekel, they select all of these covenants, all of them, like the Zoroastrians, but also for the Samaritans, for the Christians, for the Jews, like all the covenants that they can, and provide translations. And their stated purpose is explicitly to promote, like, this more ecumenical and amelioration of relations between Muslims and non-Muslims. Right? So that's kind of scoffed at by a lot of scholars. And, you know, I don't think that's a reason to dismiss the scholarship. It's just, there might be other reasons, but that shouldn't be one of them. But it also is not usually part of our scholarly narratives otherwise. Yeah.
No, still very interesting that you're looking at this scholarship. I mean, there is Western scholarship that has been dismissed in the meantime, but for this sort of reasons, like some bias, some whatever, of the same times. But they still moved us forward with the data, with understanding the data. In your case, they brought it up. And it's all stemming from one manuscript. Is that, did I understand that correctly?
Well, the Parsi tradition, we don't have the actual manuscript anymore. That Gigi Boy, a copy, supposedly a copy of the one that he worked from his father's collection, a copy of it is now in one of the Parsi libraries in India. But I don't know. I haven't been able to ask anyone or to go myself and see. But then there's a British Library one that does have the same text that he published. So that seems, but that copy is from 1802. And I will say the colophon that I mentioned that says that Nanavai Punja copied it in 1654 or whatever, he doesn't actually mention the covenant with the Zoroastrians. He mentions by name specifically the Salman Treaty or covenant. And he says that he got it from a book that he calls Tariq Bar Gozideh. I don't know if it's the same as this well-known Persian work, the Tarikh-i Guzide, which does contain the Salman Treaty and other documents relating to Salman, does not contain the treaty with the covenant with the Zoroastrians of Āḍurbāḍ's family. So even that it's a little unclear to me, like where exactly he got this covenant from. Maybe it's just in some other Arabic and New Persian text, or some recension of an Arabic or New Persian text that we don't have. And he does, and there are a few other, like I mentioned, Arabic and Persian works named by Jijiboy, and I haven't been able to consult them. But as far as I know, like the works that contain the Salman documents don't contain the Āḍurbāḍ one. So besides that British Library manuscript and Jijiboy's edition, I don't know where it comes from.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a very interesting situation, and it has relevance for the rest of us who do other traditions and other languages, because every now and again, some of the problems you showed today pop up, like where we situate a document when we could situate it between, you know, a gamut of 8 centuries. And it's always interesting. Yes. No, thank you. Illuminating in many ways.
I want to end with a very stupid question, which we can cut out if we need to.
There's no stupid question.
Well, there is. I mean, there were always, well, they do exist. I'm just really curious. I guess I know the answer, but such a document would have had any value in a Sunni context? I guess the answer is no, but I'm just wondering.
I mean, Sunnis still revere Ali. I mean, in the early Muslims. But I mean, people have tried to show, like there are other reasons to associate the Zoroastrians. They seem to have gotten on better with the Shi'i rulers at various times, but that's not always the case. I think it's the Ghaznavid court that, you know, Zoroastrian and, you know, pre-Islamic Iranian traditions are also deemed important. But we don't have a lot of information about Zoroastrians after the 11th century until the 15th, 16th century. It's at least one scholar has called it the sort of dark ages of the Zoroastrian tradition. So I don't know, but they do seem to get on, and we find more references to them during the periods of Shi'i dynasties. But I mean, their relationship with the Safavids was complicated. So yeah, does this document have any bearing in a Sunni context? I'm sure it still would if it were deemed authentic, but I don't know. Yeah.
Well, that's an entirely okay. No, this is a fascinating material. Yeah, and as Dan said, I mean, this is huge relevance even with these kind of very late manuscripts. I mean, it's very, think of the example of sort of East Syrian context from the Church of the East, where you have 19th century manuscripts and copies of very early ones, like medieval manuscripts, and you don't have the medieval ones anymore. It's like, you just have this, and you just have to say, well, authenticity. Right. Sometimes we're
a late manuscript does not mean it's an authentic, right? So no, as you describe,
No, wonderful. I'm looking around one last time to see if someone has another question. Just checking the chat. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Kayla, for a wonderful talk. And thank you everyone for joining us. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Kayla.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
See you.
Bye, everyone.